Okay, we have another public servant testifying. Let's see how idiot this guy is.
Before you begin, if you could give us your full name, spelling each of your names.
Yes, Your Honor. Madera Arredondo. First name is spelled Medaria. Last name is Arradondo.
Mr. Slisher.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, what is your current role?
My current role is Chief of the Minneapolis Police Department.
Wow, Chief. Man, is there any white chiefs anywhere? Because we were told all the problems would be solved if we had minorities in the police departments. I don't know why. That kind of implies that minorities is the big problem, and if we had minority police chiefs, the problems would go away. But we can't make that conclusion that minorities are a big problem, so I don't understand why we need all minorities. But I digress. Here we go, back to trial.
How long have you held that position?
For approximately 3 years.
And as Chief of the Minneapolis Police Department, are you responsible for overseeing the operations of the entire Minneapolis Police Department?
Yes, I am.
And that's the highest ranking role at the Minneapolis Police Department, is that correct?
That is correct.
I've never seen a chief testify in my entire career on a case. Never. First time. First time, first black chief, first time I've ever seen a chief testify.
Now, sir, I'd like you to first share a little bit about yourself with us. How old are you?
54 years old.
In what city do you live?
Twin Cities.
Where are you from originally?
Minneapolis.
Where did you go to high school?
The Minneapolis Roosevelt High School.
All right.
But I don't live there now. Why not, Chief? Well, let's just say it's a high crime area.
And have you ever lived outside of the Twin Cities, Minneapolis area?
I went away for college for a couple of years in Michigan, yes.
Where in Michigan did you go?
It was Hancock, Michigan.
Which school?
Which is now called Finlandia University. I'm sorry, Your Honor, Finlandia University.
And what is the highest level of education you've attained?
I received my master's degree.
What degree did you receive in Hancock, Michigan?
That degree was a criminal justice degree.
After you completed your college studies, you returned to the Twin Cities area?
That is correct.
And is that when you first joined the Minneapolis Police Department?
Prior to that, I had worked as a community service officer at the Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport Police Department.
What years did you do that?
How is that relevant? Come on.
I believe that was from 1987 to 1989.
And then in 1989, did you join the Minneapolis Police Department?
I did.
In what capacity?
I started my career as a Minneapolis police cadet and then was hired as a Minneapolis police officer that year.
I'm going to pause all this
Why did you decide to become a police
question.
officer?
To come from a city of very resilient, very welcoming,
Oh my God.
proud,
Political
proud
answer.
people here in the city of Minneapolis. And
Really?
my dear parents taught all of my siblings and me about the service of love. And so I've been very fortunate
my God.
to
Are you kidding
then
me?
eventually join the Minneapolis Police Department and give back to the very community. The
How
very
is this
city,
relevant?
that embraced me and has been so good to me.
You familiar with the motto of the Minneapolis Police Department?
Yes, I am.
What is it?
And that is to protect with courage and to serve with compassion.
And what does that motto mean?
We are oftentimes the first face of government that our communities will see. And we will oftentimes meet them at their worst moments. And so the badge that I wear and that members of the Minneapolis Police Department wear, it means a lot because the first time that we interact with our community members may be the only time that they have an interaction. And so that has to count for something. And so
obviously he hasn't been in Minnesota too long if he thinks most times they act as the first time for police. Most people I contacted when I was a cop have been contacted at least 10 times by other cops before I contacted them. But maybe Minneapolis is different under his leadership.
So it's very important for us to make sure that we're meeting our community in that space, treating them with dignity, being their guardians, and representing and all of the men and women that came before us who served so proudly on this department.
Sometimes you have to protect with courage and you have to use force. Is that correct?
At times, yes. As a police officer, you will have to use force.
Sometimes serving with compassion means to understand when force is not required.
Dan, rephrase.
What does it mean to then serve with compassion?
To serve with compassion, to me, means to understand and authentically accept that we see our neighbor as ourselves. We value one another. We see our community as necessary for our existence. And so that's what serving with compassion means to me.
Now, you've told us a little bit about your educational background. I'd like you to share with all of us a little bit more about your specific law enforcement training. You mentioned the academy. Is that where you received your law enforcement specific training?
Yes, it is.
Please describe how that training occurred.
I was a member of the first Minneapolis Police Cadet Program, and along with many other candidates, we received training, both academic training on the laws of the state of Minnesota. We received training as it relates to everything from driving and defensive tactics, community relations, and so we also, there's post requirements of Minnesota Post Officer Standards and Training to receive our license. There was a test that we had to take then. There was also scenario-based training as well to grade and assess how we performed during that.
The pictures I'm showing is Minneapolis Police Department serving with compassion, that he said.
Training in the academy, and so that was part of that important training that I received along with my candidates at the academy.
And that was the very first Minneapolis Police Academy?
That is correct.
And a trainee at the academy is that trainee referred to as a cadet?
That is correct.
At your employment, you've been continuously employed as in the Minneapolis Police Department since, was that 1989?
That is correct, sir.
Has the academy changed since you first were a cadet back in 1989?
It has, and while I certainly believe that at the time back in 1989 that training was important, like any police department, we should not be monolithic. Our communities are not monolithic. Our training should evolve. We should be focused on what our national best practices, and so
I hope the defense ask him about the policy of kneeling that was approved and removed after this incident.
The training that our recruits and cadets get today, and rightfully so, is far better than the training that I received those years ago.
Well, we'll circle back to that a little bit later. You also mentioned that you take post credits, is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
And POST stands for Peace Officer Standards and Training?
That is correct.
What is the requirement for post training? How many courses are you required to take in a given period?
Yeah, every sworn peace officer in the state of Minnesota receives their license through the POST, Peace Officer Standards and Training Board, and so POST will change up what some of those requirements are from time to time, but some of the ones that I think of right now would be crisis intervention training. There's certainly defensive tactics training. There's now a form of procedural justice training that is required, and so Minneapolis police officers receive that mandated training, but we're also very fortunate that we're able to receive additional training above and beyond what is required of the
Former MPD officer.
And you personally participate in this training in order to maintain your post license?
That is correct.
Chief, you began your career in 1989. You're now the chief of the police department. Fair to say you've had many roles within that department. Is that correct?
That is correct.
At this time, I'd like to publish Exhibit 209, if I may.
Sure, before you can take
we'll leave that
the
up,
sergeant's
if we may, while you testify. What was the first position you held within the department after you completed your academy training?
I was sworn in as a Minneapolis police officer.
Now, we've heard that term "sworn officer" before. Can you please explain to the jury what that means?
Sworn officer after you
take an oath.
complete the required educational requirements, and certainly after you complete your performance measures at the academy, then you are eventually sworn in at a location, and traditionally our city clerk has been there, and you take an oath, and you're sworn in as an official member of the Minneapolis Police Department, but also as a City of Minneapolis employee, and you start your employment with the city then.
And what were your duties then as a sworn police officer, that rank for the City of Minneapolis?
Primary duties was to be a 911 responder, to work in a geographical area of the City of Minneapolis in a district, at a precinct, and respond to 911 calls on a given shift.
Are those also called calls for service?
That is correct.
And as a patrol officer at that time, well, how long did you remain a patrol officer?
Approximately 5 years or so.
And can you tell the jury what geographic district you served as a patrol officer?
Yes, I served for a short time in the 3rd Precinct, and then I think the bulk of that time in the Minneapolis 4th Precinct, which is located in North Minneapolis.
During that time period, that 5 years as a patrol officer, did you ever have occasion to arrest a suspect?
Yes, I did.
How about a non-compliant suspect?
Yes.
You've had to place handcuffs on someone who was not compliant?
That is correct, yes.
Approximately, would you care to guess how many times?
I'm sure several.
Okay.
I'm sure several. Yes.
This is something that's
That means very few.
a fairly regular occurrence.
If you ask me, it wouldn't be several. It would be hundreds, if not thousands. And he had to think, well, 3, maybe 4 times.
As a police officer, as a patrol officer, is that right?
That is correct.
You've had to be in situations where you've had to use force, is that right?
That is correct.
Have you also been in situations where you've had to de-escalate or talk someone into compliance?
Yes.
And is that a regular part of your job as a patrol officer?
Yes, it is.
Even from 1989 to approximately 1994.
Yes.
Then after serving this period of time as a patrol officer, what was your next position at MPD?
And I believe in 1997, I was then promoted to the rank of sergeant in the Minneapolis Police Department.
And what do you have to do to be promoted to the rank of sergeant? What are the requirements?
Oh my God.
It is a civil service test.
I want to stop that. This is crazy.
The previous civil service positions.
This is absolutely crazy. They're going through. He was a sergeant for 2 years, didn't do anything, worked behind the desk. Then he was promoted lieutenant for 2 years, and now he's promoted to a commander. And they're going through all this, just boring the jury. How does this matter? Wow.
Police. How were you selected, or who selected you to be the chief of police?
Well, I served in an acting or an interim capacity, then under Mayor Betsy Hodges, and then after that term ended, then Mayor Fry of the City of Minneapolis appointed me as chief of police.
You may take that exhibit down. So you've had certainly, it seems, every rank available within the Minneapolis Police Department and a variety of roles. Is that right?
That is correct.
And as such, are you familiar generally with the day-to-day operations, I guess from the patrol level all the way up to the level you are now?
That is correct.
What I'd like you to do at this time is provide us with a little bit more information, sort of an overview of the Minneapolis Police Department and how it serves the city of Minneapolis.
Oh my God.
MPD's jurisdiction is within the 20. An individual named Derek Chauvin was a Minneapolis police officer. Is that right?
That is correct.
And are you aware of who this person is?
I am.
Do you recognize this person in the courtroom today?
I do.
Would you please point to him and describe what he's wearing?
Yes. Mr. Chauvin's right there. He appears to be wearing a navy blue suit with a light blue tie and white shirt.
Thank you, Your Honor. May the record reflect that the witness has identified the defendant.
All this, and we just identified
So I'd like
him?
you to please describe for the jury how MPD is structured to deploy law enforcement services to about 420,000 people over a 58 square mile area, 24 hours a day, every day. Administratively, how is the...
So he said it's about 54 square miles and 450,000 people. Just to put in reference, Sacramento is 900 square miles, and I believe it has 900,000. Maybe I could be wrong. I'll have to check that.
department organized?
Administratively, we are broken down into bureaus. And so, as I may have mentioned, you have the chief of police that really leads the organization, and it's...
Sorry, not 900, 500,000. So it has a much larger area with about the same amount of people.
Mission and vision and goals. And then we have an assistant chief that oversees the day-to-day operations. After that, there are 3 deputy chiefs. And we have a deputy chief of patrol. The deputy chief of patrol is responsible for the 5 geographical precincts throughout the city of Minneapolis.
We have lots of government supervising, lots of government to supervise, lots of government. Yet when this happens, we had no idea that it was in the policy and that it was happening.
We also have a deputy chief of professional standards. And that deputy chief oversees really 2 main functions, and that is our training for our entire department, as well as the internal affairs portion of our department. And then we have a deputy chief, the 3rd one, of investigations. So all of the employees who work, whether it's homicide unit, robbery, assault, that deputy chief oversees the investigations bureau. And we also have commanders who oversee these divisions. As I mentioned, they're above the civil service rank. They're appointed, and they serve in different divisions. And the precincts, as I mentioned, there's 5 geographical areas. We have 5 precinct inspectors, and they are like the chiefs of police for those precincts. Yes.
And so by my count, there were 3 bureaus. You have investigations, patrol, and professional standards. Is that right?
That is correct.
And the investigations bureau has a number of individual units within the bureau, correct?
That is correct.
For example, what type of units are within investigations?
Yeah, investigations bureau has homicide, assault, robbery, crimes against children. There are several different investigative units.
So within the investigative bureau, you mentioned homicide. That's where Lieutenant Zimmerman would work. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And the patrol bureau, that provides services such as 911 response, like you did when you were a patrol officer. Is that right?
That's correct.
Crime prevention, traffic control, emergency services, all within the patrol bureau?
Yes.
And in individuals, sorry. And within the patrol bureau, in order to provide those patrol services over the geographic area, we've heard about precincts. Is that right?
Yes.
And if we could publish Exhibit 269. Looking at Exhibits 269, is this the geographic area of your jurisdiction?
Yes, it is.
And then can you just use 269 to describe the precincts and what they are and what purpose they serve?
Yes, this exhibit outlines the 5 geographical precincts, and this also lets our community know which precinct, based on where they happen to live, which precinct their residence or business is a part of. And so you're able to see from this map here, Sector 1 or Precinct 1 kind of is in the center there. It covers downtown, Cedar Riverside area. The number 4 at the top left-hand corner would be our North Minneapolis precinct. And then second precinct, number 2, covers southeast, northeast Minneapolis. And then 5th precinct covers southwest Minneapolis near the lakes area. And then the 3rd precinct covers our southeast Minneapolis area.
And focusing specifically on the 3rd precinct, I see it's divided further into these sectors, is that right?
That is correct.
And that's for the purposes of being able to deploy patrol services, correct?
Yes.
Within the various precincts, this is primarily a tool for dispersing patrol officers, correct?
Yes.
But there are also investigative functions within.
It's kind of called areas of responsibility. If you're assigned to Sector 3, District 3, Sector 1, you're responsible for calls in this area. Doesn't mean you can't leave this area. If they have a big incident, these guys will back them up, these guys will back them up, these guys will back them up. But normally, if you're primary in these areas and this is your sector, you're responsible for all calls in this sector. Now, if it gets really busy, you notice some of these sectors are bigger and smaller. The smaller sectors are more high crime. They need to be small because the calls for service are much greater. So these small sectors may have as many officers or more than the larger sectors because they have more crime. Now, you can figure out why they have more crime.
In the precincts as well, correct?
Yes.
That would be specifically assigned to that precinct?
Yes.
Okay. But professional standards, that would cover all of the precincts. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. If we could publish 268, I'd like to focus specifically on the 3rd precinct. Oh, it's a little hard to see, but you can see the...
I think the whole purpose of getting this guy in here is he's a black man, and we'll get him to say that Derek was wrong and that he fired him and what he did was wrong and he caused the guy's death and he ruined their relationship. That's what I think his meat and potato testimony will be, but we'll see.
That would be represented as 310 on the Exhibit 268, is that right?
Yes.
And then Sector 2 would be Exhibit 320?
Yes.
All right. And we won't go through each of the sectors, but the purpose of these sectors, again, is to further distinguish different geographic areas within the 3rd precinct or any.
I'm wondering if they're going to say that Chauvin left his district to go over and get involved. If he did that, that goes to motive or that he was looking for trouble or that he shouldn't have been there. Maybe that's why they're spending time on this. I don't know. We'll see.
Any precincts, so we'd be able to have, say, dispatchers deploy law enforcement resources there. Is that right?
That is correct.
Dispatchers like Jenna Scurry, for example, could send a car to a particular location based on the different sectors that are within this precinct map. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
And a Professional Standards Bureau, you can take that down, please. The Professional Standards Bureau, what does a Professional Standards Bureau do?
One of the functions is training. We have a commander, again, that is one of the appointed ranks, who oversees the training division, and they're responsible for making sure that not only are our officers in compliance with our mandated post-board educational requirements every year, but also really looking to make sure that we continue to evolve and that we're staying on top of necessary training that's important for us, that has a benefit to our communities that we serve. And so that's a core piece to what our professional standards training division does.
And so within professional standards, you have the training services, and that's staffed at the, I guess it's at the commander level, led at the commander division. Last year,
administrative services, different types of programs that the city.
Cameras,
Lots of
milestone
programs,
cameras,
lots of supervisors.
generally to serve the community's law enforcement needs. Is that right?
That's correct.
Is that right?
Yes.
You respond, or officers respond to different calls for service. Could you please describe the types of calls for service?
God, dude, really?
Minneapolis Police Department commonly
This
responds
pisses
to.
off juries. Why am I
Calls for
listening to this
service
shit?
can absolutely range. Any dispute can
What type of emergencies?
medical emergencies. That's correct. Yes.
But nonetheless, MPD responds.
Yes.
Do you know approximately how many calls for service the Minneapolis Police Department receives annually?
It's usually a couple of 100,000, and then we also have officers that we categorize as self-initiated activity. So that could mean an officer happens to be driving through a neighborhood and sees something and reports out on their radio that they're going to look into it. So it's a combination, but it's a lot of calls.
And generally, people don't call the police department to say, hey, everything's going great. Just wanted you to know they have something that they want you to do.
Exactly, yes.
Well, it's called call for service.
It sounds then like it's fair to say there's more to policing than just going out and arresting people. You
Oh my
provide a
God,
broad
yeah,
spectrum
because they're all heroes,
of policing services. To
except
the
Chauvin.
Yeah, I would actually say that
They're all heroes except Chauvin.
the actual law enforcement part is probably pretty small compared to most of the types of.
So, Officer Chauvin did this for 20 years, what you're explaining. Is that correct? That's what the defense ought to ask him.
Calls our officers are being called to address and deal with. Yeah.
So we've touched on police training, your own personal police training, and how police training is dispensed, I guess, through the Professional Standards Bureau. I'd like you to describe that a little bit further. Are you generally familiar with the types of training that the Minneapolis Police Department provides its officers?
Yes, I am.
Where does this training take place?
We have a large facility located in North Minneapolis, which we call our Special Operations Center, and that is where the vast majority of our required training takes place.
Is the Special Operations Center then a dedicated building only for training purposes?
It's primarily dedicated for training purposes, yes.
And I think you testified and supervised.
That was non-responsive. He asked if it was only used, and that's not what he answered.
By a commander. I'd like you to tell the jury a little bit about when now currently training begins for a Minneapolis police officer who's hired on to the department.
For a new officer who's hired onto the department, that
I'm gonna
first
pause it
initial
again.
orientation
It's
to our training
minutia.
begins. It's usually been a mixture of recruit classes and a cadet class. I would say that we average in terms of recruit class numbers around 30. Cadets might be 20 to 25.
So now I'm going to ask you to just define some terms a little and explain to the jury the difference between a recruit and a cadet.
Recruits are typically individuals who've already been laser focused on a career. Being a Minneapolis police officer is what I wanted to do. They typically have already at least their 2-year criminal justice or law enforcement degree. Most have completed their required skills training. Cadet was really created to capture diversity of candidates. And so the cadet might have individuals who may have had a psychology degree, but it's really streamlining them in. It's a little lengthier process, but it's really getting them on board.
Diversity means we can hire women, what bathroom you use, what color you are, pretty much everything against white males.
So that they meet within lateral candidates. We certainly have had hirings of laterals in the years. Length of time, just because laterals are individuals who've already served as police officers, perhaps in another jurisdiction or another part of the state. The academy during pre-service, it's their first indoctrination. They're having community members come in.
Of the pre-service training?
That would be, yes.
Can you just give us a general description of what the FTO or field training program is?
The Minneapolis Field Training Officer Program is really, once the recruit has gone through that series of pre-service training, it's now teaming them up with a mentor, basically. And they're being gauged and judged on certain performance measures. And it takes course over a period of several months, usually about 5 months. And they're given instruction. They're seeing how well they are able to handle certain types of situations, calls. And they're also having feedback, not only from their FTO, but they're also having conversations with the supervisors in the training bureau, and seeing how they're doing. They're assessing their progression. In the event a candidate is not progressing, they're making sure that there's support mechanisms for that. Where do they need extra help? And yes, at times, we have candidates that don't successfully complete it. And so, but that's really getting them to the point where they can ultimately be really...
Training facility you mentioned?
Yes.
Is that training optional? Can an officer go somewhere else to get their post credits and skip the in-service, or is that training required?
That training is required annually.
Do you have to take it?
Yes, I do.
What type of training is provided in the post-service training?
Some of the training that is provided in the annual training can be critical incident training, CIT training.
CIT is crisis intervention training?
Crisis intervention training, thank you. Yes, crisis intervention training, defensive tactics, basic CPR or first aid. Those are some of the types of training that is required annually. Yeah.
Even though they've already ostensibly been trained on all of these things before, you're still doing the same training annually?
That is correct.
Why is that?
A lot of that is just to reemphasize the importance of the training itself, muscle memory, because all of our department members are being taught the same thing. We may have officers that are working in a patrol capacity 1 year, and the next year they may be in investigations, but they may be called to assist upon. And so it's making sure that all of us have that basic necessary core fundamental training to better help serve our communities.
So if you could give the jury kind of an idea of the amount of time that is spent training your officers.
It's a lot. We put a lot of time, energy, and resources into our training. I believe last year, the Minneapolis Police Department, in terms of our mandatory in-service training and leadership training, we probably spent about $8.5 million. In our pre-service and in-service training, that was probably about $4.5 million. So training is absolutely vitally essential to us as a department.
And officers are paid while they're being trained, is that correct?
Yes, they are.
And would it be fair to say that part of the objective of training is to impart Minneapolis Police Departmental policies onto the officers so that they know what those policies are and are able to apply them?
Yes, it's important through training that we're reemphasizing not only our policies but really our values as a police department and what our community expects of us. It's to help our officers, and it's also to help our communities at the same time.
As a former patrol officer who's used force, put handcuffs on people, I mean, you understand the reality of what policing is like when you're actually on duty. Is that right?
That is correct.
You also testified that you've participated and continue to participate in the training.
How is this long-ass testimony done anything to educate jurors on the innocent guilt of Derek Chauvin? Outrageous.
That's been provided by MPD and has continued to be provided. Is that
Yes,
right?
that is correct.
Is this training practical and useful?
Yes, it is.
Why do you say that?
Our officers are being called, particularly patrol officers, are being called to, again, respond in a way to our community's needs. And it's hundreds of thousands of calls.
This guy wanted to be on TV, and that's why he's here. It's a political bullshit. I can't believe the defense hasn't said, Your Honor, relevance, relevance, relevance.
That they respond.
From a practical standpoint, to the patrol officer out on the street, is this training practical, or is it more aspirational?
No, it's very practical, and as I meet our communities where they are, and I'll give a couple examples if you don't mind. We've talked a lot about within the department that we know that our communities suffer at times and go through trauma. So it's very important for our men and women to have training as it relates to how we respond in those moments. What resources can we provide for community?
How much money can we spend of the taxpayer money to get our budget bigger next year?
And sadly, I felt police have played a role in their lives, and not always good, quite frankly. And so we were able
talking about
to,
the transgender
through conversation, through discussion, through meetings, being very authentic, we were able to sit and craft a policy based upon members of our transgender, gender nonconforming community really guiding that. And we had the first policy ever in that. And so, again, it's so important that we as a police agency continue to evolve, continue to...
Absolutely nothing to do with this freaking trial. I can't believe that they're letting this guy ramble. Why don't we just bring in the fire department and explain how they respond to calls? I mean, it's just crazy.
All of our community members.
Fairly extensive procedures to be in a written form so that officers can understand what the expectations are.
Yes, it is.
And those are public documents so that the public, they're also able to see what the expectations of the police officers are, correct?
That is correct.
As the chief of police and being employed by MPD as long as you have, I take it you're familiar with the Minneapolis Police Department policy and procedure manuals and all the content contained inside?
Yes.
You in fact created some of these policies?
That is correct.
Are Minneapolis police officers required to be familiar with the various written policies?
Yes, we are.
And there's a policy requiring them to be familiar with the policies, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
All right. So if you would please publish Exhibit 207. If you would highlight Section 1-103. This is the policy about the policy, and it requires that
policy about the
MPD
policy.
Employees shall be provided instructions on how to access the policy and procedure manual. Is that right?
That is correct.
And they're accountable for knowing how and where to access, and for knowing the contents of the manual. Is that right?
That is correct.
And they're also required to sign a receipt acknowledging their responsibility for knowing the contents of the manual, correct?
Yes.
Because the first policy manual that you would receive as a patrol officer might not be 30 years later what you're going to be looking at, correct?
Yes.
So the policies are changing, but they're published, they're public, and the officers are required to know what they are and to sign something saying that they will continue to review them. Is that right?
And that's leading and accept.
Yes.
All right. Well, if you could take that one down, please. At this time, Asked to just display to the witness Exhibit 274 for identification. Sir, do you recognize this is a general form here of being an electronic version of the MPD Policy and Procedure Manual acknowledgement?
Yes, I do.
This is an example of an acknowledgement form that a Minneapolis Police Department employee patrol officer would sign upon being hired. Is that right?
Yes.
Just indicating that they're aware that there are written policies and committing to reviewing them and accessing them. Is that right?
Yes.
At this time, I'm going to offer Exhibit 274.
All right, so I'm not sure what's going on here. Let's take a look at this policy that they've since removed. Back in 2020, 8/10 of 2020, the policy is neck restraint, non-deadly force. So the lieutenant, with all the years on the force, which was the expert, said the neck restraint was deadly force. Obviously, he didn't read the policy, he didn't sign the policy, and he was unfamiliar with the policy. Or he wouldn't have stated that neck restraint is a deadly force option when it plainly says it is a non-deadly force option. Oh, and the chief looks all professional with his hands being held, and spent 2 years sergeant, 2 years lieutenant, 2 years commander, 2 years as the deputy chief.
All right, if we could then publish Exhibit 274 to the jury. And you see this is, again, one of the forms that was signed by a particular officer upon hire. And if you could please highlight the name.
Derek Chauvin.
And that's signed by Derek Chauvin. I'm so sorry. Derek Chauvin, badge 1087, December 28, 2001. Is that correct?
Yes.
They're using a signature from 2001 against him.
Minneapolis Police Department has a code of ethics. Is that right?
Yes.
And the code of ethics is contained within the policy manual. Forgive me, we're going to be talking a lot about the policy manual. I kind of marched through some of these, but
You
the
ain't
code of
marching
ethics,
through
if you
nothing.
could
You're
please
dragging ass
display
and dragging this
Exhibit
out.
215.
This is probably a critical part, but he's
Page
struck it
2.
out so much that nobody's going to be paying attention, including me.
And if you could highlight 5-10201.
He's going to run this through lunch. He's just kind of a pain in the ass.
And as the Code of Ethics provides in the policy manual, law enforcement officers' fundamental duty to serve mankind and safeguard lives and property.
So we're going to put a guy in prison because the Code of Ethics. Really? Is that a crime? What section says that if you violate the Code of Ethics, you go to prison? How does this... This is just ridiculous, dude.
Minneapolis Police Department also has a professional policing policy. Is that right?
Yes.
At a high level, can you describe what professional policing means in this context?
Yes, our Minneapolis Police Department professional policing dignity and respect. Dignity and respect. Above all else, at the highest level. It's that we see each other as necessary, we value one another, and it's really treating people with the dignity and respect they deserve.
You mean like the dignity and respect where you fired Chauvin when he was out there doing his job and a felon was being committed and he died because of an overdose and you fired him even though your policy said he could use his knee? Is that the respect you're talking about? No, Rick, not that respect. Okay, I got it.
Sir.
And drawing your attention to page 404.01. Sir, is this the professional policing policy?
Yes, it is.
And could you read the first bullet, please?
The first bullet reads, be courteous, respectful, polite, and professional.
And if you would then also read the third bullet.
Ensure that the length of any detention is no longer than necessary to take appropriate action for the known or suspected offense.
And you can take that down, please. Sir, fair to say that law enforcement generally has changed a lot since you started back in 1989, is that right?
That is correct.
1989, you didn't have body-worn cameras, correct?
That is correct.
And nor did you have sort of the ability for civilians, bystanders, to video or record conduct of police officers, right?
We did not.
Because we didn't have smartphones.
That's true.
And now we do.
Yes.
And as you indicated, the policies and culture of the
funny.
police department has to change with the times, is that right?
Yes.
And so in terms of understanding that sometimes bystanders do use their smartphones to take video images of police officers, has the Minneapolis Police Department imparted any training or constructed any policies to prepare officers for people recording them?
Yes, we have. We've imparted policy that really is informing officers that individuals under their First Amendment rights, they have the absolute First Amendment right to record through cell phone video or other types of video.
Good.
Officers interacting or engaging with a community member.
They should
with
be
the
allowed.
exception that they cannot obstruct the activity of the officers, but they absolutely have the right, barring that, to record us performing our duties.
And what does obstruct mean in this context?
Obstruct would mean interfering, doing something where you are physically placing yourself in a position where you're no longer, or you're prohibiting the officers for carrying out their lawful duties. But barring that, individuals have the right to record our engagement with our community.
Well, Chief, you'd have to acknowledge that a patrol officer may find it irritating to have a civilian recording their activities.
Why?
True?
Very true.
Is that obstruction?
It is not.
At this time, I'd like to display to the witness only Exhibit 273. And if I may step away for a moment. And at this time, I will offer Exhibit 273.
Any objection?
No objection.
273 is received.
If you would publish 273, and I'd like to draw your attention to Section 9-202. And again, this is the public recording of police activities, providing employees guidance with dealing with members of the public, recording them. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And generally, this informs officers that unless you're being obstructed.
So where I think he's going here is he's setting the stage to say it's in the policy that they can videotape you. So they really weren't a threat to you, and they were merely exercising their right to videotape you. So you had no reason to be concerned. Therefore, you have no reason to neglect your care of your in custody. I think that's where he's going with this.
Yes.
What is de-escalation?
De-escalation is providing a knowledge base or skills, in this case for officers, to really focus on time, options, and resources. It's really primarily trying to provide an opportunity to stabilize a situation, to de-escalate it, and what the goal is having a safe and peaceful outcome. And so there's tools associated with that, but that's really the goal of de-escalation. time, options, and resources so that we can stabilize the situation peacefully and safely.
When you think of de-escalation, are you thinking of it as the sort of the opposite of using force, or is it a part of using force?
We teach it as both.
And when you started with the department back in 1989, was there an emphasis on de-escalation?
It was not mentioned. It's not heard of back then.
Okay. When did de-escalation start becoming more of a topic of conversation in law enforcement communities?
I think that right around late 90s, 2000, I think that when we were, when there was attention, not only in Minneapolis, but in departments across the country, and incidents particularly involving police encounters with those who were suffering from mental illness, we really started to see a lot of work on that. Here locally, the Barbara Schneider Foundation, there was a very tragic incident in Minneapolis many years ago that involved the death of a community member. But when we started, that was really what kind of culminated for our department, de-escalation. And even when you heard departments starting to talk about other tools like tasers, all of these types of things, it was around that time frame that I think our department really started getting a lot more education, awareness, and training as it relates to de-escalation.
What about just, even if you weren't taught de-escalation formally when you started back in 1989, as a practical matter in practice, is that something that's been employed by experienced police officers for a long time now?
Yes, it has.
What about in your own experience? When you were on patrol, did you use de-escalation techniques?
Yes, quite a bit. Yes.
And did you find them to be effective, a way to maybe talk somebody down from a situation rather than needing to use force?
Yes, and with the primary goal is that you want to keep yourself safe as an officer, and you also want to keep the community safe. And so a lot of it hinged on communication and listening and verbal skills. And so if you could talk your way out of a situation.
I can't deal with this captain anymore. I mean, it's just going to be total BS. If you want to go watch it on live, you can. I'm just not going to waste more time on it. I'm going to end this here on him.